Today concludes this sermon series on surrender in the storm. And last week, we've actually been looking at these slight little details in these stories of Jesus in a storm. And these storms would happen in the Sea of Galilee, which was kind of common in that sea. There'd be these sudden storms that would all of a sudden ravage through kind of the lake. And of course, one of the things that we talked about was at least 4 of the disciples were professional fishermen. So there's this irony then of this juxtaposed professional fishermen who are kind of manning the sea. And there's Jesus and his kind of interaction with what happens in the sea. And last week we looked at this story, and there's this detail, right, where the disciples and the professional fishermen go out ahead in the boat, and they're a considerable distance away. Jesus himself goes to a mountain to pray, and a storm comes, and this boat is buffeted by the waves and the wind. And Jesus somehow just strolling down the mountain and walking along as he's walking along. And this boat, because of the waves, it can't go any further. And Jesus, who's just walking along, catches up to them. I mean, how ridiculous is that? And one of the things that I pointed out last week was, I mean, that's who Jesus is. He's just strolling. He's just walking and floating on the water. Meanwhile, you can get the picture of the disciples straining with all of their might, and with all of their know-how and fervor. And it's just kind of this image of, wow, Jesus, like there's this effortlessness to Jesus, because he's God. And how even in this pandemic and in this storm, how I've been someone who's been so kind of focused on what can I do better? How can I be stronger? When really, perhaps the call for me has been to surrender. And perhaps that's the call for you as well. Now we're going to look at another different storm that comes, and here's what the passage says. So check it out. In Mark chapter 4, it says, "That day when evening came, he said to his disciples," this is Jesus speaking to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. Now, so if you can imagine, there's 12 disciples. They go into the boat. Some of them are professional fishermen. There were also other boats with him. Now, a furious squall came up. Again, here's that sudden kind of wind and waves and storm. And the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. And Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" Now, look at what it says. If we can go to the next slide. He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this?" Even the wind and the waves obey him. Now, maybe you've heard this story before, and maybe you're not even a Christian, but you've been exploring faith, especially with all that's happening. Well, I want to give you a picture of who Jesus is and was, and why he's so significant, and why, especially from this text, I think we get these little clues that show just how dynamic and powerful Jesus is. Now, there's one little point I want to make, of course, because I've been trying to condense these sermons as much as I can. Just as one little point that I want to point out. If we can go to the next slide. I love this little detail that's given. Look at what it says. That day when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. And look at this detail that Mark, the gospel writer, as he's probably someone who had been journeying with Peter, who's one of Jesus' most prominent disciples. Look at this little detail that's given. Hey, don't forget to mention, Mark, when you're writing this story about Jesus, Jesus was in the stern. I totally remember like it was yesterday. And he was sleeping on a cushion. Sleeping on a cushion. One translation puts it, he was sleeping on a pillow. Now, I just love this image because there's this crazy storm going around, and there's Jesus. And hey, don't forget this image, Mark, when you write this story. It's the image of Jesus. He is so chill. He is so unperturbed by what's happening. He's just chilling on a pillow. I mean, I love this. He's sleeping on a cushion. There is no fear. There is no being overwhelmed. Um, this story is actually a story that was depicted in a painting by Rembrandt. Rembrandt, of course, in the 17th century, he's a Dutch painter. Many folks know him for his just all the different layers of colors and art. And I don't know enough about art to say how impressive he is. I just know that the paintings that he paints are extremely moving. And he is known to have also depicted different biblical images, and this was one of them. The image of the storm over the Sea of Galilee. Now, if you look at this image, and if you look closely, one of the interesting dynamics of this image is, first, of course, one side is lighted on the left, and on the right, it's all in darkness. Now, if you notice the side that's lighted, where you see kind of the waves are crushing over, there's this person at the top who's probably the leader trying to figure out what the sails are. You've got these people working with the mast that's been torn apart, and there's this ray of light that's happening. Here's where the action is. People are trying, these disciples are trying their best to manage their way through the storm. Now, Jesus, meanwhile, is actually, if you look to the right of the painting, there's a picture of Jesus who's in the boat, and he's got a little bit of a bright shine around him. It's Rembrandt's way of kind of highlighting, hey, here is where Jesus is. He's actually lying in the darkness. Now, there's something about that here Jesus is lying in the darkness. Now, one of the things that Rembrandt is actually known for is he's actually known for putting himself into the paintings that he draws. Now, what's fascinating about this particular drawing is that in this painting, and again, there's 12 disciples, but aside from Jesus, there's actually 13 men in the boat. And some believe that what Rembrandt did was he actually painted himself in this picture as well. And one of the reasons why he did that is because he, as someone who wrestled so much with faith in Jesus as well, realizes in so many of these stories, we can find ourselves in similar situations where we're buffeted by wind and waves, where we are wondering, how in the world are we going to get out of this mess? And now there's many conjectures about which person is Rembrandt in this painting. But if you were to notice, here's what I do know. If I were to ask this question for each of us, if we were to reflect on this painting, here's the question. The question is, who are you in the boat? Are you one of those at the top who probably you have all the expertise in the world? You are someone that's often unflappable in the face of peril. And you are someone who just knows what to do, and you go straight to work. And maybe that's what you've done in the midst of this pandemic. You've thrown yourself in because that's who you are. You are New York tough. You are strong and smart and bright, and you just know what you can control. And so as a result, this is what you've done. You are very competent and capable, and you're trying to do things on your own strength. But meanwhile, you're being pounded by the wind and the waves. Are you one of those disciples at the top of the boat in the lighted area where you're doing your best, things are falling apart, and it's almost this pending doom that you're facing, and yet you don't know what else to do but to wrestle and to do things by your own strength? Maybe you're others in the boat. There's people in the boat in the dark area. There's that person who's kind of leaning over the boat about to vomit. And it's just been a sickening time. Maybe you're someone else in the boat. If you can see those around Jesus, some of them are incredibly fearful. They've been really afraid, deathly afraid. And maybe that's been you in this season. Fearful, anxiety-driven. Finances are low. People are getting sick. It's been an awful, awful time. Maybe there's some of you, there's a couple of disciples who they're looking at Jesus and they're angry at Jesus. They're like, what are you doing? Dude, you call yourself the Son of God. I can't believe I just said dude, but dude, you call yourself the Son of God, and we've got this ridiculous storm, and we're about to die. Now, if you notice, actually, though, there's one person in front of Jesus, just above the disciple who's vomiting. There's one disciple who It looks like the disciple has a little bit of a halo over his head. He's right in front of Jesus, and he's just kneeling before the Lord. And I suspect Rembrandt, it was his way of saying, there are some of us, though, in the midst of a storm, know that when it absolutely comes down to it, the invitation is to kneel and to surrender. Question for you and for me is, who are you in the boat? I know that I mentioned last week that I have tried to carry this sense of calm and as if like all things are good and I got this and I'm built for this moment because this is what pastors do. Pastors are really strong and in the midst of chaos and difficulty. And I think it's been pretty awful season though. And it's been an invitation. I think I've tried by my own strength at times to do the best that I can. I think it's just been an invitation for me, especially now as we don't even know what the future holds in these coming weeks and months. What would it look like for me to surrender to Jesus in the storm? I mean, I love the detail. He's sleeping on a cushion. Just remember to write that, Mark, because that's who Jesus is. Like in the midst of all the chaos around us, Jesus is sleeping on a pillow. This is not a surprise to him. You know, and I love what's said at the end of this passage. Look at what it says. The disciples basically say, who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. He is someone who is not surprised by the predicaments that we go through, the suffering and the difficulty. And I think that's one of the wonders of this passage is that Jesus is not surprised and he's not shaken by it. In fact, he is over the wind and the waves. And I think in the same way for us today, he is not shaken or surprised by what's happening around the world. Now, of course, this begs the question, though, for me, and I suspect for you as well, the question of like, then what in the world are you doing, God? And you know, I can imagine being like the disciples, like, Jesus, what are you doing? What are you doing? And I imagine just as Jesus just got up, he's like, quiet, be still. And he says, why are you so afraid? You still have no faith. I imagine that the invitation for us is as we're in the boat with him, the invitation is to surrender first, and maybe we'll begin to understand later. And I don't quite understand why we are in the season that we're in, but the invitation for you and for me is to surrender to Jesus in the storm. Now, some of you might wonder, though, like, how do I trust, though? Like, this is an awful season. How do I trust that God and his ways are good? Maybe I do believe that the wind and waves do obey him, but how do I know that God is good? You know, the amazing thing about the Christian faith is that it's a story of Jesus, who is God incarnate, God in the flesh, who comes into the world, who lives through every predicament that his disciples and the marginalized, oppressed people under the Roman Empire, the Jewish people, would go through. He would be someone who would experience the loss of death. He'd know the intense feelings of suffering and pain and sickness. And he'd know the dramatic fears that happen when these storms come out of nowhere and they cause us to lose our footing. He knows all these experiences. Now, more than any other religious system or philosophy, here's the wonder of the Christian journey and the Christian faith. It's that God incarnate, he would come to experience what we experience, to be in it with us, even to the point of death. Now, isn't that startling? That this God is not a God who is removed from our deepest worries, our anxieties, about where our next meal will come from, or our finances, or our jobs, or our families. In fact, Jesus is in it with us to the point of death. But of course, we know that on the other side of this story, we know that resurrection would be the end of that story of death. And because of that, what's amazing is that these disciples who would be in this boat, they would actually go on, having been captivated by the news of this Jesus who has resurrected from the grave. They would be so taken by him that they lived with such a fervor and a fire and a fearlessness that came from knowing that their Savior lives. Even where these disciples would face their own imminent death. Even the wind and waves. Because they knew even the wind and waves obey it. And when they can entrust their lives to this God, what do we have to worry about? What is there in the world that can touch us? Last week, I mentioned this passage, and here's what I'd like to end with today is this passage where Jesus, he says to his people, now here's the thing, which of the disciples are you in the boat? Here's the invitation for you this morning. Would you come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Now, what's interesting is that Jesus doesn't talk about your life will be void of suffering. Instead, he says, no, don't you understand? When you are with me, when you come to me with all of your weariness and burdens, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And even if you were to confront death itself, you will find that my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So the invitation to you is to surrender. The invitation to me is to surrender.